That land lay hidden deep within the northern European mountain range, where snow blanketed the sky all throughout the long, endless winter, and the wind howled through the mountain crevices like ghostly whispers echoing from ancient times. There were no highways open year-round, only frozen trails veiled in ice flanked by towering trees that rustled, as if murmuring secrets to those daring enough to enter. This was no place for the faint of heart or those afraid of solitude. For when darkness fell, the world seemed to be swallowed by an icy silence, leaving only the wailing wind and the dry branches scratching violently against the windows. A small wooden cabin stood isolated on the edge of the dense forest, home to 3 generations old: Harold, his daughter Ingrid, and his 8-year-old grandson Emil, a bright-eyed, energetic boy with a strangely sensitive soul. Harold was a lean but sturdy man with snow-white hair and eyes that held the depth of someone who had witnessed too much loss. People said he was once a firefighter in a major city, retired after surviving a massive blaze that claimed the lives of his entire team. After that tragedy, he brought his daughter to these mountains, choosing seclusion as if to bury the past. Ingrid, a woman nearing 40, was calm, private, and devoted her life entirely to her son and aging father. They lived by making handicrafts and selling small forest goods, self-sufficient and simple. Yet what made the cabin truly special wasn't the people but the being, Argo, an aging German shepherd who still carried the piercing gaze of a warrior. Argo once accompanied Harold on life-threatening rescue missions, detecting trapped survivors beneath rubble where no device could reach. He was called Harold's third eye, a companion and extension of the man himself, and at times a soul returned from the dead. The house wasn't large, but it was sturdy, with a chimney that reached skyward like a pillar, defying the cold. Inside it was warm and filled with relics of the past: a firefighter's helmet, an oil lamp, faded photographs of rescue teams, and one special picture, a young Harold embracing a jet-black shepherd puppy, Argo in his youth. Framed and hung with reverence, not for show, but as a tribute to what was lost and what still remained. Though surrounded by wilderness, the family showed no fear. They were used to the howling wind, to the snow blocking their paths for weeks at a time. They were cautious by nature, stockpiling firewood and food, always double-checking the doors each night. Argo was always the first to sense anything strange, from unfamiliar footprints on the porch to a strange burnt smell in the wind. He never barked without cause, but when he howled, it meant something was about to happen. Each year when winter came, the old forest around the house seemed to awaken in strange ways. Ingrid said that on snowy nights, she would sometimes hear someone softly calling outside the window. "It's just the wind," Harold would reply. But his eyes told a different story. He never denied what she heard. He simply chose not to dwell on it. Argo, whenever that voice returned, would let out a low growl and stare into the darkness. Sometimes he would snarl. Sometimes he stood firmly at the door as if refusing to let anyone go outside. Everything was ordinary until that night. Before the incident, the sky was filled with dark, leaden clouds heralding the biggest snowstorm of the season. The wind shrieked against the walls as if trying to rip off the roof. Ingrid secured the doors more tightly than usual. Emil, usually playful, was oddly quiet. He sat by the fireplace, gently stroking Argo as if trying to say something he couldn't put into words. Harold saw it and frowned slightly. He had seen that look before, human and dog, sensing an approaching storm connected by an invisible thread of instinct. "That dog's acting strange, don't you think?" Harold asked softly. Ingrid nodded. "He's been staring at the door since the afternoon, won't touch his food." Harold said no more. He walked over to the old dog and gently stroked his head. Argo let out a faint whimper and licked his hand as if trying to warn him of something. Harold had saved hundreds from danger, but never had he trusted any instinct more than that of this dog. That night they tried to sleep early, or at least pretend to, but the strange feeling lingered. The wind howled like a long, piercing scream. Snow pelted the windows like insistent knocks. And Argo, still awake, lay under the window, eyes wide open, as if guarding against an invisible phantom lurking just outside. They didn't know that, on that night, something was approaching the cabin silently and patiently, and Argo, the old dog who seemed long past his prime, would once again become the hero in a nightmare wrapped in white. Argo was no longer young. The once glossy black fur around his muzzle was now streaked with gray. His steps had slowed, and sometimes his hind legs trembled slightly when he rose after a long nap. But his eyes, those amber eyes, still held the same alert, intelligent, and unwavering gaze as they always had. In the cold wooden house nestled deep within the snowy mountains, Argo was more than just a dog. He was a living sentinel, an instinctive warning system, and an invisible shield for the entire family. Ever since Harold rescued him from a collapsed burning house more than 10 years ago, Argo had followed him like a shadow. He had once leapt through a wall of flames to pull a child to safety, lain flat on icy ground for 2 days to trace a missing person's scent. Argo had been trained in a professional rescue unit, but after their final mission, he, like his master, carried a past that couldn't be erased. Argo survived, but something in him had changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn, and at times it felt as though he could sense things that no human eye could see. That night, as the whole cabin lay silent under the season's first blizzard, Argo didn't curl up by the fireplace like usual. He stood motionless by the small northern window, the one that looked out over the dense forest. Ingrid was the first to notice. She quietly walked over and softly called his name, but Argo didn't turn. His ears were upright, his body taut like a drawn bow, his eyes fixed on a point in the swirling darkness beyond. Argo is something out there, Ingrid whispered, her heart tightening. No response, no bark, only that gaze locked onto something invisible in the woods. Ingrid gently pulled back the curtain to look outside, but all she saw was thick snow and swaying pine branches. She tried to convince herself it was just Argo, reacting to a lost squirrel or fox. But something inside her refused to rest easy. Then Harold walked by and saw the scene and stopped immediately. He didn't look out the window. He looked at Argo, and from that one glance he knew something was wrong. He had seen Argo react before earthquakes, before the seismograph even moved. He had heard him howl before an avalanche struck the village. He had seen him scratch fiercely at the door to warn of a stranger lurking nearby. "There's a smell in the wind," Harold muttered as he stepped out onto the porch. Argo didn't leave his post, but his eyes followed Harold's every move. The moment the door opened, a blast of icy wind slashed through the house like a knife carrying something strange. Not the smell of smoke, not the scent of animals, but something else. Something like rusted iron, musty and sharp, mixed with wet grass and cold earth. The scent of something not of the human world. Harold inhaled deeply but said nothing. He quietly shut the door and locked it tight. "Don't go outside tonight," he told his daughter. "If Argo won't leave that door, something is coming." Ingrid shivered slightly. She had never seen her father this grave. The house fell into silence. Even Emil, the boy who usually played endlessly with Argo, sensed something was different. He crept over to the old dog, sat down beside him, and gently stroked his back. Argo didn't react. He only closed his eyes for a moment, then reopened them, sharper than ever, as if he were listening to footsteps far away, sounds no one else could hear. By midnight, for the first time in years, Argo howled. It wasn't a typical bark of alarm. It was a long, low, broken howl, a distant warning. Harold sprang up like a coil and rushed to the window. He saw nothing but blackness, but he believed in that howl. "He's saying something is standing at the edge of the forest." Ingrid trembled. Could it be a wild animal? A bear? Harold shook his head. "No, Argo doesn't howl like that for bears." He went to the cupboard, opened it, and took out an old hunting rifle, worn but well-maintained. He laid it on the table, not to use it yet, but as a quiet reminder this was deep forest land, and tonight might not be a normal night. No one slept. Every strange noise from the woods made them jump, and Argo never leaving his guard post. Sometimes he'd walk to the door, sniff the air sharply, and growl a deep, low growl that didn't threaten but declared, I know you're there." By dawn, the snow had lightened, still falling, but gentler. Ingrid cracked the door open just a sliver to check outside. And that's when they saw the footprints. Not human, not ordinary animal tracks. They were larger than human feet, unusually long and deep, forming a trail that led from the forest edge to the foot of the porch and stopped. Not turned away, not vanished. Simply gone, as if something had stood there all night, watching them, then dissolved into thin air. Argo growled again, the sound rumbling from deep in his throat. The hair on his back stood straight up, and Harold whispered so quietly no one else could hear. "They've come back." The snow fell thicker than ever before. Since the start of winter, there hadn't been a single night when the wind howled as fiercely as it did now, whipping across rooftops and tree lines, making the entire forest seem to pant beneath the weight of the ice. The window panes rattled, and the wooden walls creaked with every gust. Ingrid stood by the window, tightly pulling the curtain shut, before turning to look at her father. Harold had been sitting still for hours, his eyes fixed on the hunting rifle laid across the table. Argo was still there, lying in the middle of the room, ears perked, eyes wide open as if guarding some invisible boundary. That night it all began with a knock. No one in the house could believe their ears. In the middle of a raging snowstorm, who could possibly be out there? Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, and chilling. Ingrid froze in place. Emil, who had been tucked in his blanket, sat up instantly, his face pale. Argo growled, not loud, but deep and low, the sound vibrating from his throat like a grinding engine. In the night, Harold raised a hand, signaling for silence. He stepped softly toward the door, listening closely. No voice called out, no footsteps followed, only the wail of the wind and snow battering the porch. But the knocking hadn't been imagined. Argo had reacted, and Argo was never wrong. He took the rifle and walked to the door. Ingrid gasped, "Dad, don't open it." Harold nodded gently. "I know, I just need to be sure." He peered through a small slit near the hinge, just enough to see a portion of the outside snow blanketed the steps. No footprints. No one was standing there, but then a shadow, just for a moment, a slanted figure cast across the snow. Tall, faint, shapeless, as if something enormous had passed through the yard and vanished into the forest edge. Argo lunged forward, his body tense like a steel cable, letting out a snarl from deep within. Ingrid screamed and ran to grab him. But before she could stop him, Argo had leapt up, using sheer force to knock open the half-latched door and dashed into the snowstorm. "Argo!" Both Harold and Ingrid shouted. Argo's howl echoed into the night, long, agonizing, and was swallowed by the wind. No one had time to react. It all happened too fast. Harold tried to follow, but the snow and wind surged like a living wall. He barely managed to pull the door shut and bolt it again. His face was ghostly pale, eyes red with worry. Something came, and Argo, he went after it. For the next 3 hours, no one slept. Emil sobbed for Argo, heartbroken. Ingrid trembled by the window, staring into the darkness. Harold sat unmoving, hands clutching the rifle. Near dawn, the second howl echoed farther away, raspier. But this time it was followed by something else. A screech like metal dragging across stone. A growl. Nothing like Argo's. Something deeper. Bigger. Not a dog, not any forest animal. Then silence. As morning broke and the snow eased, Harold and Ingrid burst out the door, braving the cold to investigate. The strange footprints from the previous day now multiplied, twisted, chaotic, as if something had circled the house throughout the night. But among those bizarre tracks was blood. Red blood splattered across the white snow. Harold knelt to inspect it. Not human blood. No drag marks. No body. Just scattered drops suggesting the wounded creature had still been moving. And mixed among the prints were familiar paw marks. Argo fought. Harold murmured, eyes full of emotion. They followed the blood trail into the forest. The deeper they went, the more tangled the tracks became, like Argo had deliberately lured the thing farther away into the thickest parts of the woods. Eventually the trail vanished. Harold stopped. The old dog sacrificed himself, he said softly. He knew he couldn't win, but he pulled it away to save us. Ingrid broke down in tears. Emil clung to her arms, sobbing. The three returned home, hearts heavy. But as they stepped onto the porch, they froze. Something was lying there, a torn piece of fabric likely ripped from a cloak. It was soaked in blood, but not Argo's, and the stench it carried was foul, so vile that Harold had to cover his nose. This isn't human. They brought it inside, sealing it in a plastic bag. Harold planned to send it to a friend in town, a former military man who specialized in investigating unexplained phenomena. For the next 3 days, Argo didn't return. The snow began to melt. They had slowly accepted the truth that the old dog had fallen in the forest. But on the evening of the fourth day, as the pale sun cast light on the dull gray snow, Ingrid heard a faint, weak scratching at the door. She opened it and collapsed in tears. Argo stood there, body torn, dried blood crusted on his fur. One eye sealed shut, but he was alive. He had come home. From the moment Argo staggered across the threshold, his body soaked in blood, fur matted in clumps, one eye nearly torn out. The atmosphere inside the cabin froze. Ingrid collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around the beloved German shepherd's neck, her voice trembling. "You came back. Argo, you're still alive." Harold and Emil stood behind her speechless. None of them could believe that the old dog had survived that dreadful snowstorm's night. The wounds on Argo's body weren't just numerous. They were terrifyingly deep. His forelegs torn, shards of metal lodged in his side, likely from clashing with something overwhelmingly powerful. His tail was nearly severed, and his snout bore gashes sharp as blades. "Not a forest animal," Harold muttered as he carefully removed each fragment from the wounds. "Nothing in these woods could have caused gashes like this. This is something else, something not from our world." And they spent the next 3 days nursing Argo. Ingrid never left his side, changing his bandages, cleaning the dried blood, and feeding him warm broth. Strangely, despite the severity of his injuries, Argo never whimpered. He just lay there silently, his eyes razor sharp, tracking every movement in the house like an ever-watchful sentinel. As the wounds began to scab over, something strange became clear. Argo was no longer the same. Before, despite his bravery and loyalty, he had been an old dog. His reflexes dulled his steps, limping from arthritis. But now, only a few days later, with wounds barely healing, he was already walking again. Not just walking, his steps were firm, strong, almost rejuvenated. Ingrid noticed first. One early morning, she entered the kitchen and saw Argo sitting upright, staring out the window. His body was taut, ears pricked, posture like a drawn arrow. Ingrid shivered, not because he looked at her, but because of how he looked outside, as if he saw something, something no human eye could perceive. "Since that night, Argo isn't the gentle dog he used to be," she told her father after dinner. "He's unnaturally alert, and there's something in his eyes that frightens me." Harold nodded solemnly. "I've seen it too." Then the strange occurrences began. The first night after Argo regained strength, a foreign object appeared on the doorstep, a jet-black stone, ice-cold to the touch, etched with a bizarre spiral symbol. No one recognized. Ingrid reached out to touch it, but Argo immediately growled, stepping between her and the stone. He nudged it off the porch with his snout, then clawed at the ground as if trying to bury it. By morning, the stone was gone. 2 days later, those strange footprints reappeared, circling the house in erratic patterns. But this time, Argo had noticed them early. He stood guard all night, eyes fixed on the door. Every time the wind howled from the forest, Argo growled low in his throat, as if warning something that was drawing near. Harold decided to install a camera outside an old device he used to monitor deer. That night, no one in the house slept. The next morning, when they reviewed the footage, all three were stunned. In the pitch-black night, a towering shadow moved past the house, silent, gliding on 4 legs like a beast, but its posture was eerily upright. As it approached the window, Argo, captured from inside, let out a fierce growl. The shadow paused, then slowly retreated into the woods. Something had followed Argo back from the forest. It might have marked him, Harold said, eyes still fixed on the screen. But at the same time, another change occurred, this one not just in Argo, but in the very air surrounding the house. Though the strange events continued, the cabin remained untouched. The eerie footprints never crossed the porch. The shadows lingered but never dared to approach. It was as if Argo's presence, bearing an otherworldly energy brought back from the edge of death, had become an invisible shield. Ingrid began documenting everything. She noticed that on nights with strong winds and pale moons, Argo would sit in the same spot right on the front porch. Head held high, eyes locked on the forest, as if watching or guarding a passageway. And on those nights, strange things always happened. Whistling sounds with no source, silhouettes darting past the window, and small, twisted objects, stones or gnarled twigs scattered across the yard. Argo never attacked, he simply stood guard. One night, Ingrid tried an experiment. She placed a piece of wood by the door marked with the same spiral symbol they'd seen on the black stone. Around midnight, Argo noticed. He let out a howl long and high-pitched like nothing they had ever heard before. By morning, the wood was half burned, though there had been no fire. Harold said only one thing. Argo had seen something humans were never meant to see, and now he carries a part of that darkness with him. Yet alongside their fear, the Harold family also felt something deeper: gratitude. Though Argo had changed, though what he brought back didn't belong to this world, he remained there, a silent guardian protecting the family. No one called him a dog anymore. Emil whispered his new name, the Watcher. And Argo, with his weathered body and eyes now deep as an abyss, continued to sit on that porch each night, beneath snow, wind, and pale moonlight. Ever since the night Argo returned, battered, broken, and with eyes no longer the same, the Harold family's life had changed forever. Gone were the peaceful days in their snow-covered mountain refuge. In their place came sleepless nights, constant vigilance, and increasingly undeniable signs of something supernatural. Something deliberate. Ingrid began to notice a pattern to the strange occurrences around their home. Each time a low crescent moon hung in the sky and the wind shifted from the deep forest, there came knocking from inside the walls, shadows flickering at the edge of vision, but not present in reality. The forest birds would fall silent, and their sheep would panic without explanation. It was as though there was a contact zone between this world and another, and the Herald's cabin sat on its threshold. And Argo, ever since returning from that snowstorm in the forest, had become the center of it all. Ingrid began documenting his behavior every night. She noticed that whenever Argo sat frozen, unblinking, fur raised. Those were the moments the room's temperature would drop, the radio would crackle with static, and the lights would flicker without power loss. He doesn't just sense them, Ingrid wrote in her journal. He names them. Harold didn't say much, but he knew. He'd seen this before back in his youth when he worked near the far northern reaches of Lapland. A mining collapse had left several men missing. Only a rescue dog had returned. What followed were occurrences eerily similar to now. At the time, the local Sami people had warned, what has seen the other side no longer fully belongs to this one. One night, the air turned unnaturally cold. Snow fell even though the season hadn't yet begun. Argo began clawing furiously at the door to the firewood cellar, a place they hadn't entered in years. Ingrid tried to stop him, but Argo suddenly growled violently and leapt at the door, snapping its hinges. Inside, the air shifted immediately, thick, cold, and putrid, like the stench of long-forgotten corpses. For the first time, Harold spoke. "It's time I told the truth." Back in 1981, after retiring from the Border Patrol, Harold had joined a classified government operation investigating strange reports deep within this very forest. A meteorological research station had gone silent. 4 men went in. None came back. What they found that day was a chamber, a ritual site, symbols identical to the spiral etched on the black stone. Argo brought back drawn in blood, chants in an unidentifiable language, and at the center, a stone door sealed shut, unbreakable. Harold had buried that door beneath the woodshed, and now Argo had found it. Ingrid was stunned. "You've hidden it all these years." Harold nodded, his voice heavy. I thought I could keep it asleep. But Argo woke it. Everything began to make sense. When Argo ran into the forest that night, he hadn't simply chased a threat, he had been called. Perhaps by the thing buried beneath the ground, still waiting for a gatekeeper to awaken it. But instead of surrendering, Argo had resisted. And in doing so, he never fully returned the same, the quietest among them. Emil finally spoke. If it wants to come out, and Argo is the only one stopping, will it ever stop trying? No one answered. 3 nights later, the final sign came. At midnight, all the clocks in the house stopped frozen at exactly 2:17 a.m. The second hand stilled. The lights died, and outside the window, there wasn't snow, but a thick, unnatural fog. From within that mist, a figure, no, a thing shaped like a man approached the house. Towering hunched head, crooked unnaturally to one side. It moved with heavy steps but made no sound. Argo let out a howl, not a bark, but a sound that echoed like wind whistling through a hollow throat. He lunged onto the porch, standing directly in front of the door, his body trembling, but his eyes burning with resolve. The creature stopped. In that instant, Harold saw two pairs of eyes, one Argo's glowing like burning coals, the other the darkness is black bottomless. A silent confrontation began. The strength of loyalty, the will to protect, clashed with something ancient, something that had existed before time itself. Go. Howled again, this time a summoning. A spiral symbol glowed on the ground, identical to the one they'd seen before. And in the faint light, the creature stepped back, not in fear, but in response to some binding force. Perhaps Argo, forever changed now, bearing fragments of the beyond, had become the true gatekeeper. By morning, the snow had melted, the fog vanished. Argo lay collapsed on the porch, his eyes still open, watching the forest. Ingrid knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck, whispering, "You stopped it, didn't you?" No one knew for certain what had happened, but from that day forward, the strange signs ceased. The symbols disappeared. The cellar door was sealed, forever buried even deeper than before. Argo, once just an old sheepdog, was no longer a pet. He was a gatekeeper, a silent protector on the edge between two worlds. Winter passed quietly, as if the terrifying nightmare of the previous months had been nothing more than a hallucination born of weary minds. Snow gently blanketed the mountain slopes again. The sheep grew bold enough to leave their pens, and life in the wooden cabin seemed to return to its usual rhythm. But Ingrid knew some things once awakened never truly sleep again. Argo, the once gentle and devoted German shepherd of the family, had become a symbol of something far greater. After that night, when he faced the entity from beyond, he gradually grew weaker. Not in body, his warrior strength still held, but in spirit, as though he was shouldering a burden too great for a soul that once belonged solely to this world. Harold no longer spoke of what had happened. He quietly reburied the stone door beneath the cellar, poured cement, laid heavy wooden planks on top, and stacked crates over it. Every time Ingrid Riot stepped down into that space, she could still feel a chill cut through her flesh, even with the fireplace roaring above. Ingrid decided not to leave. Though she once thought this place had become too dangerous, she came to understand if they abandoned it, who would guard what lay sealed below? Who would protect the door? The answer, of course, was Argo. Since that night, Argo no longer slept inside. He chose to lie at the entrance of the cellar, unmoving, unfazed by the cold, the snow piling on his back. Every time Ingrid tried to coax him back in, he only looked at her with calm eyes, gently shook his head, and returned to his post. That look was no longer that of a dog, but of a soldier, a warrior who knew the enemy, still lingered, and who had chosen to remain on the front line. One night, Ingrid awoke from a strange, half-dreaming state. She heard Argo whimper, not in pain, but almost like a chant. She looked out the window and saw his silhouette faint in the snow, mouth slightly open, eyes gazing toward the deep woods. And she swore for just a moment there was a dark figure among the trees, nodding and then gone. It seemed the war was not yet over. One day, Emil, the boy who had always been closest to Argo, found something strange beneath the snow near the cellar. a wooden shard carved with the same spiral symbol Argo once brought back from the forest. But oddly, the back of the shard bore an inscription in ancient Latin, Custos inter mundos, the guardian between worlds. When Harold saw it, he only sighed. He said nothing, just stroked Argo's head and walked away silently. Emil turned to Ingrid. Who is Argo really? Is he still a dog? Ingrid didn't know how to answer. Argo had clearly once been a dog, but now, what was he? A soul transformed, a traveler between realms, or perhaps a living door bearing the form of sacrifice? There were no answers. Perhaps there didn't need to be. Time passed. The Harold family remained in that cabin. They learned to accept Argo's quiet, towering presence as part of the home itself, like the roof, the chimney smoke, or the old tree in the yard. Even the sheep seemed to understand that something had changed. They no longer avoided Argo. Each morning they gathered around him as if seeking his protection. One late autumn evening, as twilight fell earlier than usual, Ingrid saw Argo standing still, staring long at the forest. This time his gaze wasn't cautious but calm. As if the time had come, Ingrid stepped outside, sat beside him, and placed her hand on his neck. His fur was cold and stiff, like rusted iron, but his heartbeat was steady. "Will you stay here forever?" she whispered. Argo didn't answer, of course. But as she stood to go inside, he nudged her leg one final time like a goodbye, then turned back to face the woods. That night there were no stars. The forest was deathly silent, and Argo remained there, eyes locked on the place where the invisible door between worlds once opened. Years later, the house remained inhabited. Legends of the forest watchdog spread far and wide. Some even built a stone statue resembling Argo, a granite sentinel standing before the cellar, a place no one dared to approach. Travelers said that sometimes they heard growls rising from the earth, followed by a lone bark, deep and firm, echoing from the mist. No one knew if Argo was still alive. Some claimed to see him walking through the lawn. Some swore they touched his icy fur. Others believed he had become part of the door itself, a living soul lodged between two worlds never fully belonging to either. Ingrid, in her final years, wrote a single line in her journal. "We once raised a dog, but in truth he was the one who kept an entire world sealed on the other side." And so it was, whether the story ended or is still unfolding. No one knows for sure. But if one day you find yourself lost in the snowy northern mountains and you hear a distant bark echo through the thick mist, know that Argo is still there, waiting, watching, and making sure the door never opens again.